So I did my internship in surgery. I came back to New York. I was at Einstein. I was one of a few women interns in general surgery at Jacobi Hospital in 1985, which was daunting to say the least. I got through the internship. I started ENT, and it became clear to me that there was just no way that there were enough hours in the day for me to be able to do the kind of research that I wanted to do and practice ENT and surgery and have a family. I was married and I desperately wanted to have children. So after a bout of pertussis from a non-immunized child, I stopped moving for enough time to think about what I really wanted to do, and I decided I wanted to leave surgery and go back to the lab. And I went to Ralph, and again, in his absolute generosity, I said to him, look, I just want to leave. I want to be done with this. I need to take a break. Maggie Pack, who was by this time his trusted assistant, was going on maternity leave. I said, look, I know all the assays. I can come and fill in for Maggie while she's on maternity leave. And he looked at me and said, nice try, but you need boards in something. You know, he didn't have them, but clearly I wasn't him, and times had changed. He said, you need an academic home and a medical center. And he helped me to get a position in pathology across the street at Cornell. Pathology being the sort of labbiest of all the specialties. And you know, he said, it was true, I'd always liked morphology. I liked looking in the microscope, and I still do. So I went into the anatomic pathology residency there. And by the time I started the residency, I was actually pregnant with my first son, Josh, who's now 31. So I was back here really at Cornell, but you know, coming back here on a regular basis. And to say I was much happier was an understatement. And it was clear to me that this was the path that I wanted my life to take. And I had my first son, Josh, and then I was chief resident in anatomic pathology. I had my second son, Zach. That was in 1989. And then I followed my ex-husband first to Buffalo, to the Roswell Park, and that was not a good fit for a variety of reasons, and then to Washington, D.C. So my position in Buffalo was with Dr. Tom Tomasi, who had been here as a graduate student and was a friend of Dr. Cohen's. Dr. Cohen was on the scientific advisory board of Roswell Park at the time, but there were a variety of reasons that it wasn't so suitable, more about living in Buffalo than about the lab. And then I went to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, and in Buffalo, I'd had one more son, my son Daniel, and then I arrived in Washington at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, 8 months pregnant with my son Joseph. And forgive me, I'm just trying to think how to say this without taking way too much time. A friend of mine from ENT pathology was there, Bruce Wenig, and he had a collection of tissues that he had put together for a post that had been presented as a poster at a pathology meeting of HIV-infected tonsils and adenoids from individuals who it was thought that they had lymphoma, but when the tissues were removed and they were examined, though they looked like lymphoma histologically, when stained with P24 for P24 antigen, they contained transcripts of HIV or protein of HIV. And this was the primary diagnosis of HIV for these individuals. And he was publishing it as a diagnostic dilemma, not to be fooled. And he said to me, you know, if you come and look at these, you can be on the paper. Because the AFIP, there was this complex Byzantine sort of, everybody had to look at them, and if you looked at them and rendered a diagnosis, that was considered sufficient for authorship. Well, I took one look at these tissues, and it was clear to me that there were infected dendritic cells. And I said to him, you know, I think they're infected dendritic cells here. And he said, well, what are those? So I said, well, let me tell you. And I, of course, then as now, I'm never happier than when talking about dendritic cells. So I said to my colleague, Bruce Wenig, you know, let me tell you what these cells are. And I was then, as I have been my whole life, just so enthused about them. And I went on and on about them. And he sort of sat there, and he was a very kind guy, and he listened and listened and said, I get it. How do we look for them? And I explained that we could just do some more basic immunohistochemistry because by this time there were antibodies that marked them, and we did. And I remember getting the tissue back from the histology lab. I mean, this wasn't a research lab, this was a pathology lab. And I looked at them and I saw the cells lit up and I thought, wow, this is really important. But I was 8.5 months pregnant. So I knew if I told Ralph, and I had remained very close to Ralph, working with him, talking about ideas, writing back and forth, and faxing back and forth. This was the age of fax. But I said, I knew if I tell him this, he's going to make me work really hard. And I'm 8.5 months pregnant with 3 children and a full-time job. I think I better wait till I have the baby. So I waited till Joseph was born, and Joseph was born in December. And I called Ralph, I guess in mid-January, for his birthday. Yeah, I called him for his birthday in mid-January, and I told him. And he said, are you sure? Because at this point, he had demonstrated with Melissa Pope in his lab that HIV replicated in dendritic cells abundantly, and that likely dendritic cells were an important field for the replication of HIV, particularly when they were fused in syncytia with T cells. This was highly controversial. It's hard to communicate how controversial it was at this time. And people accused him, as they had for his whole life, of this being a laboratory artifact and could only be done by him. And what I had in the tissue were syncytia of dendritic cells and T cells that were abundantly replicating HIV. So I had an anatomic correlate in a human being, effectively an experiment of nature, that confirmed the importance of his laboratory findings. So his first question to me was, are you absolutely sure? And my answer was no. And he said, well, I better come and look. I said, yep, you better come. And he said, don't tell anybody. I was then, as I am now, chatty. And he's like, do not go to a meeting. Do not tell anybody. We don't want anybody to scoop us. So that would have been in January. I said, well, I'll be coming home for Passover. I'll bring the slides. So I came home for Passover. I brought him the slides, and he looked at it, and he said, what you have is real. Don't tell anybody. And he said, I'm going to help you work this up. And then he said to me, and again, with a kind of nerve that I don't know that I would have now, he said, you need to go to your institute director and tell them you need the summer off to work this up, and I'm going to help you. So I thought, how am I going to tell them I need to go off service to work on this kind of obscure project? He said, this is going to be high profile. So I went to the institute director. I said, this is where I've come from, this is what I've done, and they knew all that. And he said, these are my findings. And Ralph says, and surprisingly, she said, okay. She said, if he'll help you, we'll help you. And so this was the beginning of what would become my only first author science paper. The findings were confirmed. We did a series of experiments. We did RNA in situ hybridization, which was a very demanding laboratory technique that's not done very much anymore. But we did it. We demonstrated in 2 ways that the finding was true, and it was published in Science. I was the first author, and Ralph was the last. I wrote the first draft. Ralph rewrote it. I'm not sure that there are 2 words that I put together that he didn't change. He was a wonderful writer, and he really told the story in a way that very few people know how. And that really changed my life, because that work came to the attention of the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And by now, a series of things had happened that made dendritic cells more interesting to other people. And among them were the technological advances that allowed other people to work on them. Because when Ralph worked on them, when I worked on them with Ralph, it was all primary dendritic cells being dissociated out of tissue. And because, as I mentioned earlier, they're very rare, they were very fragile, they're post-mitotic, and they love to die. So you would spend 3 days working on an experiment just to get 10,000 cells. And then you'd have to figure out what to do with these 10,000 little gems that you had in your hand. And few people had the patience, the skills, or frankly the money, because it was very expensive, to do these experiments. There were a few, and we were sort of this little band of people off in a corner. But then with the development of recombinant cytokines, it became possible to take progenitor populations and drive them into being dendritic cell-like. In the beginning, we referred to them as dendritic cell-like, but now I think people are pretty comfortable that these cells are, in fact, a very good model for primary dendritic cells. It's been many years since we've felt that way. And so the field exploded. And all of a sudden, there I was at the epicenter of this growing field. And so the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research was very closely allied with the AFIP, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. And my work came to the attention of Don Burke, who was he's now the dean of the School of Public Health in Pittsburgh, maybe, I'm not sure where, but he's an important public health figure. He's really a vaccinologist, but he was interested in this exciting new field, and I could do it. I knew how to make the cells, and Ralph would help me, and I could come back here to the Rockefeller whenever I needed to learn something new, which was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. So he asked to have me detailed to the Walter Reed. He said he would give me a lab to work in for 6 months, and I would teach them to make the cells. So I was thrilled because I was going to get back to the lab. The fact that I had 4 small children was a little overwhelming, but I figured, you know what? I wasn't going to have the opportunity again. I was 35 years old, which was just about the age that Ralph was when I met him. Back then, people had their own labs at 35. Now, unfortunately, I think the age of first R01 is like 41. But I went to the Walter Reed. I worked very hard to get the system up and going. I worked closely with John Mascola, who's now the head of the Vaccine Research Center at the NIH. And Deborah Birx, who was our department director, really saw the value of my work. She's now the AIDS czar. She's the highest ranking federal official dealing with AIDS internationally, and she heads PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. She's a remarkable woman, and she would become my other both dear friend and critical mentor, because she saw the importance of my work, and she believed in me despite the fact that I was the mother of these 4 boys. And she allowed me a kind of flexibility in my work that allowed me to have my life and do my work. And I don't know that without that I could have accomplished anything close to what I've accomplished. So she's was both a brilliant scientific mentor and an important personal mentor to me. And she showed me that one could have a family and be open about it in a way that I had not before. So she was the department chief, and she and I worked closely together. And then in the 6 months that I was there, Don Burke was promoted up, and she was promoted up to become the division chief. And when she became the division chief, she came to me and she said, "I'd like you to stay." And I don't think I was ever happier, perhaps, than when Ralph first invited me to come into the lab. So I stayed with her at the Walter Reed for almost 8 years, and I maintained my position at the AFIP because I loved it there and they were very kind to me, but they understood that it was to everybody's benefit because every paper that I wrote, and there were many, had both affiliations, and I worked in the lab on dendritic cells both as a target for HIV and as effectively an adjuvant for HIV vaccines, because the Division of Retrovirology at the Walter Reed was there to develop an HIV vaccine to protect the troops on deployment. And in fact, I had the opportunity there to work on RV144, which is the clinical trial which demonstrated that it is in fact possible to protect a human being from HIV with the vaccine, which was not commonly thought. There were a lot of people who were willing to give up, and Debbie really had to fight tooth and nail to get that trial done. But again, in a really fortuitous turn of events, because I had only an MD and not a PhD, my title was medical officer, and I was required to learn clinical development. I had no interest in clinical development at the time. All I wanted to do was be in the lab with the dendritic cells and figure out how they were interacting with a variety of viruses, how they were working to make vaccines work better, and how we could capitalize on them. But the US Army had greater wisdom, and they felt that I needed to learn enough about clinical development so I would be competent. And that meant project management, manufacturing, good clinical practices, regulatory affairs, community outreach, among other skills. Every time they made me go to one of those 2-day seminars or weekend seminars, I was whining and muttering under my breath, not out loud, but under my breath. that they were taking me out of the lab. But in the process, I was assembling a skill set that would turn out to be immensely valuable. So as time went on, things went well for me scientifically. My children were growing up, but unfortunately my marriage didn't work out. And in 2000 it became clear that I was going to get divorced. And I knew that as much as I loved being at the Walter Reed and as much as I loved working for Debbie, and I did, it's hard to explain the pleasure of both hard money and a group of colleagues working on an important, scientific and clinical matter all together really in a team way. I had wonderful colleagues there, John Mascola, Nelson Michael, Debbie, who, as I said, was just wonderful, a remarkable mentor and leader. I knew I had to come back to New York.
Can we stop